Morning, good afternoon, hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Neda Hanafi. I am one of the co-founders of MedTech Color and also sit on the executive planning committee for the MedTech Color collaborative community. And we're really excited because we have our second installment in this discussion where we're learning to design with diversity and inclusion in mind. So MedTech Color is an organization, it's a nonprofit, and we're focused on advancing the representation of people of color within MedTech. And we convene the collaborative community to create a forum where MedTech professionals and other stakeholders such as patients, researchers, innovators, and industry at large can come together within a community and address minority health issues in medical device product development and clinical research. We're working collectively to develop strategies, resources, best practices, and thought leadership so that we can increase awareness and mitigate the impact of unconscious bias and social determinants of health and the lack of inclusion or consideration of racial and ethnic minorities in critical aspects within the product life development life cycle, as well as clinical research. So I want to thank the Product Development Subcommittee for helping to produce this discussion today. And just briefly, the collaborative community has four subcommittees, and we also have a steering committee. And I'm super excited because Dr. Cherise Sparks is joining us on this panel today, and she chairs the steering committee. We then have the Disease State Awareness Committee, and that's led by Regina Dibble and Stephen Makita. Our Recruitment and Retention Subcommittee, which is led by Dr. Diana Barber, and our Product Development and Clinical Research Subcommittee, that's hosting today's panel or webinar, and that's led by Kendall Whitlock, and our Evidence Development Subcommittee led by Molly Vandeker. If any of these subcommittees raise interest and you'd like to join us, please feel free to reach out. We welcome new members and we'd love to include your perspective and voice within the work we're doing. So without further ado, I'd like to get today's session started. And as I mentioned, we have some returning members, some familiar faces, two familiar faces and two new faces to add to the dialogue today. And we want to ground the discussion on the best practices to think about product design considerations and specifically with the end user in mind. We want to elevate awareness and understanding regarding the importance of including diverse and these underrepresented participants in clinical studies. And because we got some great feedback from the first webinar and some really valuable questions, we want to start the discussion with some of the questions we didn't get to during that panel and then move on from there. So I'm excited and I would like to welcome and invite our esteemed panelists to come on camera. I'll give them a few minutes. Awesome, welcome. So you know how I'm going to start this. I'm not going to take the pleasure of having you introduce yourselves because I'd like to name, your organization, where you're joining us from today, and then a brief introduction into the work that you're leading, because I know you're leading a lot of amazing efforts to advance equitable innovation. And then briefly, what success or meaningful change within this space looks like to you. So I will start it off with Jamie Wheeler.
Thank you, Neda. Thanks for having me. So my name is Jamie Wheeler. I'm the Senior Vice President of Clinical Affairs at a major medical device company, so Edwards Life Sciences. What that means, if you're not familiar with clinical and medical affairs, is we actually we design and execute all of the clinical trials that generate the evidence to allow us to put a medical device into a human. So it's all of the safety and efficacy data. I've been working for a number of years with AdvaMed and now with UNETA and MedTech Color Collaborative to try to help ensure that women, and now we're actually expanding the conversation, the dialogue, and the action to include all ethnic groups, all minoritized groups, socioeconomic groups, geographic groups, not just men and women, into clinical research. So that's a passion of mine for as long as I've been in research and something I've really been focused on. And if I round that into what makes meaningful change for me, it's actually that we progress this conversation from just being a conversation to actually seeing tangible change where everyone is granted access to medical care and to life-saving technology. It's not just for certain populations. And that would be meaningful if we could really change this in the next 3 to 5 years.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you for adding your voice and drive to this discussion. Anthony, Tony.
Hi, everybody. I'm Anthony Hong. Everybody calls me Tony. Thank you for having me today. So I'm Vice President of Preclinical, Clinical, and Medical Affairs for what's known as Cardiovascular and Specialty Solutions Group for Johnson & Johnson MedTech, based here in Southern California. Very similar to Jamie, my team and I are involved in worldwide clinical trials, but also involved in upstream development with R&D, with the preclinical activities that we handle, but also working downstream with our commercial colleagues, as well as with external physicians, in bringing the voice of the patient as well as the physicians in many of our clinical trial activities, as well as upstream R&D. So really involved in all of the worldwide trials. This is an area of very important sort of passion for me. I sit on multiple DE&I committees within J&J. And for us, as we continue this work, what success looks like for me would be in terms of sort of 2 Ps that I think about: patients and physicians. I would love to see increased diversity in terms of the physicians that are involved and leading clinical trials. And in that regard, we've already started establishing diverse physician advisory boards to get more physicians involved. And the other P, of course, are patients. Seeing greater diversity in terms of patients that are part of our trials, and also thinking with those patients in mind as we develop upstream R&D and products. And so seeing this over the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years would be really amazing success, at least in my mind.
Sure. Thank you, Tony. I appreciate you coming back. Kimberly, a last minute addition, and we're really appreciative to have you be part of this panel. So thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm Kimberly Sterling. I work for ResMed, a San Diego-based medical device and digital health company. I'm actually based in Indianapolis, so I work remotely, and I am the Vice President of Health Economics and Outcomes Research within our Medical Affairs division. And so, like Jamie and Tony, I work on the evidence generation side. I actually have the pleasure of not only working with real-world data, so data that's already been collected, but even my team, as our colleagues on the clinical side are developing studies, we actually get a chance to talk about what other types of measures could be included to actually capture the patient perspective. Because I work in a field where it's not only thinking about the patient and physician, but also from a payer access perspective, diversity and inclusion is really at the heart of what we do. We're constantly thinking about who is that target population for which we would want access to our medical devices, and making sure that we have the evidence to generate that. Over the last 20 years of my career in health economics and outcomes research, we have constantly talked about there's definitely inequities, there's definitely different responses to medications, and now that I'm in the medical device world, thinking about that and having to design for differences. I actually sit at the intersection and every day get to talk about the importance of diversifying our research platform, and also have a chance to empower some of our younger researchers and associates to really think about what can you do in your seat every day to really think about this. So it's not just coming top down, but actually coming from the bottom up. And so we have a lot of great initiatives that have happened that I'll talk about during our time together. And success for me is that it's no longer a you must do this, but it becomes part of the fabric of our designs of all of our research, from the very beginning of development all the way through post-market plans. And then also it's not just the medical divisions or your clinical teams who are pushing for it. You're actually having your commercial team saying that this is really important. It's the right thing to do at the end of the day for patients. So thanks again. Looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Kimberly. And Dr. Sparks, saved the best for last, our fearless leader for the steering committee. Not that none of you are the best. But well, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation. It is a joy and a privilege to be here today to speak to everyone. And I just get to ladder on to what my distinguished colleagues have said. I am the Chief Medical Officer for a digital therapeutics and immersive therapeutics company called Applied VR. And we are reimagining the way medicine is delivered to patients and how we can end suffering for many. And so my job encompasses intersects all of the people that you heard today. I'm responsible for our medical, clinical, regulatory, and quality efforts. And so each part of my division touches as Tony says, from hearing the voice of the patients to how we influence and how we prepare physicians to deliver care, to how we develop those solutions and what goes into developing those solutions. I totally agree with Kimberly. This cannot be a one-off. It has to become part of the DNA of how we do everything that impacts the lives of patients, not some patients, but all patients. And so what good looks like to me, because I have another unique experience. I'm also an orthopedic trauma surgeon. So I have delivered care. I've also seen care denied to people. And so what I want and what looks good to me is for this entire life cycle, from ideation of a great innovation to help change the lives of patients, to the delivery and dissemination of that technology or that solution to patients, to be able to reach and enhance the lives of all patients equitably. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Dr. Sparks. So you can see why we have this esteemed panel here. At the heart of it is the patient. Everyone mentioned it. And then I like Tony's 2 Ps, patient, provider, or physician. And then I'd add Kimberly's pair, right? And then the evidence piece, if you don't collect that safety and effectiveness data, that's going to show that it can work accordingly in that intended patient population, you're likely not going to get to clearance or approval or getting to market. So the commercialization piece as well in the end. And upstream, Jamie's clinical study aspect, I actually think it needs to be moved upstream. It's not a downstream approach. So all of that said, thank you for the wonderful introductions. And I'll jump into the first question, which really speaks to why we're here. That the theme here is the patient, that end user. We're learning to design with the end user in mind, keeping the diversity, equity, and inclusion lens at the forefront. So I'd like to go across and ask you what processes or practices, approaches that you or your team or your organization are currently developing that allow you to better understand the unique needs that patients may have when they're considering adopting a new medical therapy or device or technology, and how then you feed that back into the solution you're developing. So there's multiple pieces to that question, but how about I start with Anthony or Tony, if that's okay?
Of course. So this is a really, really important question. The last time during the panel discussion, I talked a little bit about some of the process that we have. Now, I won't get into the specifics of all the different steps in terms of our innovation portfolio and the different steps that we have across a multitude of functions. But the one thing that I want to touch on is what we call the voice of the customer. So if we don't understand what the needs of the downstream customers are, the physicians in this case who are adopting the technology, but also how the physician is using that technology to treat the patients across a multitude of therapeutic areas, then we're essentially doing R&D development in a silo. That would be easy to do, right? We could easily be locked up in a room doing the work ourselves without taking into consideration truly what the unmet needs are, what the patient's needs are, and how the physician will use that technology. Because operator variability, of course, is an important aspect of the development as well. So the key thing that we're trying to do is really bring in more of the voices externally in shaping our upstream activities, not just in terms of R&D products, but really also as we design clinical trials. Now, Jamie and many of us here who are involved in clinical research will attest to the fact that we also as industry aren't reaching out directly to patients. So after patients are consented, I'm not having direct conversations. However, how do we leverage the relationships with the physicians that we work with, the diverse physicians that we include in the work, in upstream R&D as well as clinical trials, and understanding their interactions with patients and how they're using the technology to bring that into our development. So these are some of the things that we're doing, but really it's the external voices that shape our internal work, and we're trying to do more and more of that as we go forward.
That's excellent. I'm sure, Jamie, you probably have a lot to add on there, but that same, bringing it at the ideation phase of including the patient perspective that all of you've kind of touched on now. So Jamie, do you have anything to add?
Sure. So I would say we're now working at the policy level. So one of the things that we identified is a byproduct of policy and reimbursement trying to place outcomes, so certain volume requirements on hospitals in order to get really good outcomes for patients. An unintended consequence was everybody was suffering from a lack of access at community hospitals. And so we identified this through looking at a bunch of data, and we've now been working on the policy side to try to draw attention to this matter and try to figure out ways that they can reduce volume requirements to enable more community hospitals to participate, which in theory, right, is going to allow more marginalized populations access to these technologies that are in early stage development and in clinical trials. The second piece that we have also identified, and I'll put this out to the group, is because we're not able to reach patients and care providers directly, as Tony said, we don't interact with the patient daily. We've now started to put out messaging, whether it's on social media, in print materials, and television, that if a patient or a caregiver sees these signs and symptoms and needs more information, please contact X for an educational kit. And we're finding that actually is now getting information out to a broader group.
Awesome. Thank you, Jamie. And Kimberly, I see you nodding ferociously, so please chime in.
No, I mean, I think what Tony and Jamie have talked about are so important. I think another thing is the sensitivity of your internal staff to the different or diverse patient voices. One of the things our leader of government affairs and market access did recently was an initiative of using art and patient voices to really talk about where are some of the challenges of either accessing our devices, getting a diagnosis, or even through that whole process of engaging with physicians and other care facilitators. And so we actually have a rich amount of patient videos. And so as I bring my team together, and we've also been sharing this internally, is let's listen to the patient. So as we're designing our studies, whether they are prospective randomized clinical controlled trials, or we're doing retrospective database analyses, what are we trying to look for? We may have to do proxies for some of these challenges, but really understanding what that patient goes through day to day is really powerful and reminds you every day of why you're getting up and coming to work. I think that becomes really critical. The other thing is, I think, Tony, you hit on the diverse investigators or physicians. That becomes really important, and really making sure that as you're listening to physicians, you're making sure that they're listening to patients. Charisse alluded to seeing care denied. I've had that as a patient. Fortunate thing is I'm well educated. I'm a pharmacist, so I knew to challenge and push back when there were certain assumptions or biases being assumed, so that I could get the proper care. So I think we always have to remember that physicians are great, but they're still proxies. And the more that we can get to a patient voice and really listening to what is most important to them, I think we get a lot closer to that inclusive design. So wanted to bring that into the conversation.
That's awesome. Thank you. And Charisse, you oversee the whole product lifecycle, like you said, where you sit right now. So I'm sure you have some very innovative processes similar to what others are employing, but any additional unique approaches that you're specifically seeking out would be wonderful to hear.
I would just say one of the byproducts of, the terrible pandemic that we were in was the maturity of decentralized clinical trials. So a way to get the patients where they are in their homes or in their own communities without having to have a structural building for them to have to travel to get over. And now this doesn't provide itself to every kind of technology, but many technologies we can look at developing protocols which use a decentralized platform. But the other thing that it spawned was, just as everyone is saying, how do we hear what the patient is saying? So we developed solutions to harvest that information also in a decentralized way. So again, through technology such as the cell phone or on the computer at community centers, if they didn't have a computer at home, to do voice of customers right in the communities where they are amongst their friends and peers. So not bringing people into strange environments to ask questions, or having them be familiar with those that are soliciting the information, so that we get more valid and more in-depth and more probably culturally specific information, which is what we are actually looking for. So those are some of the tools that we're developing, is the maturation of decentralized clinical trials, effective data gathering through other technologies or other ways of actually reaching patients where they are.
Thank you, Dr. Sparks. So, I mean, we talked about end user, the patient is at the heart of it. And Kimberly, you hit on the next topic I'd like to address, which is bias, and moving towards the theme of diversity and inclusion of diversity from the start of the product life cycle. So we know that there's biases introduced at any point throughout the development of a product. And it's important, we've all said it, we all know it, important to include diverse perspectives, especially when it comes to the team developing or ideating and then prototyping and further developing the solution, this medical device that could truly improve outcomes for patients. But we also know, and this was a big piece that came out of our first installment of this discussion, that most engineering teams are comprised of predominantly male and overwhelmingly white males. So there's a huge chunk, or maybe a lack of understanding of what the patient you're trying to meet their needs are, what those unique needs are. And you all spoke to kind of ingraining it in your team or making it organic, rethinking with diversity in mind. But if you could speak to how we can overcome some of those biases and include more diverse perspectives in those engineering teams, and what efforts you are all employing to achieve that, since it's so critical. Maybe Dr. Sparks, we'll start with you.
I think that's a really, really important insight. And what I would say is, we as industry, or those that have the resources right now, need to turn those resources back to the communities. So giving kids as young as junior high or high school just the opportunity and the insight to see what engineering is. Many of them have never even heard that word other than being on a train and an engineer on a train, but they don't understand that they build buildings, they build ecosystems, they build space stations, they build medical devices. And just the word medical device, many of these kids don't even know what that is. And so, not that there's not talent there, there's untapped talent. And so I think it's our responsibility to tap the talent, to understand ways to unlock and let them actually visualize what success could look like. Give them a reason to aspire, not to just exist, but a reason to inspire and aspire. And so what we're doing is, throughout AVR, we've developed an internship program where we go into historically Black colleges and universities and offer insight into digital therapeutics or virtual reality, and looking at healthcare even in a very different way than what you would think about traditionally. Also going with communities with around our home facility in LA County to the high schools and junior high schools there, just to introduce the idea of technology and how it's made. So what does the code mean that writes these programs? And so engineering crosses multiple disciplines, across multiple different needs. And so just providing insight, I think, is one thing that we need to do. And then once we see the results of that influence, we will see the successes that are had, and that will help to bend bias the other way.
Thank you. And Tony, I see you nodding because I know you've spoken to this and you're taking some efforts to reach into our younger generations and expose them to the opportunities within MedTech. So maybe you could add some color here.
I love what Cherie said. So first, I'll say success begets success. And you look at this panel of amazing individuals, amazing women, and WLI is an important area of focus for us at J&J. And seeing what can be accomplished, what success looks like among a diverse group of leaders, I think is very important. And showcasing that to the younger generation, very, very important. I also think internally we need to have some uncomfortable conversations. We got to look at ourselves and question whether we are truly diverse. Whether we have the appropriate, not only diversity, but inclusion, right? I often say that if I'm only in a room, or I'm in a room with only people that look like me, that like what I like, life would be very, very boring. And so we have to have those conversations and say across our groups, not just engineering, but really across all of our functions, since implicit bias can really impact and affect anyone of any background in any function. We have to have those uncomfortable conversations and ask ourselves, are we really moving the needle? And then lastly, to Sharice's point, I think we got to go farther upstream, right? Advocating for minorities in STEM at the high school level, partnering with universities, graduate schools, medical schools for recruiting diverse students and helping them really understand specialization in fields where we have to have greater minority representation and where we see disparities in healthcare, and really promoting that among the younger generation of students, I think can really help to move the needle in the future. It may not be, 5 years from now, but certainly if we continue in this effort, I think change can really happen.
Awesome. Thank you, Tony. Kimberly, do you have anything else to add to this discussion?
Yeah, no, I love the fact that we're looking to invest and inspire the younger generation. I think it's changing our recruitment strategies and going to places that we typically don't go to. I love, Sharice, that you mentioned HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities. That is untapped potential, and it's going to different markets than what we traditionally have done. I also think internally, and this goes a little bit to what you were saying, Tony, is having individuals who are really inclusive design champions. So in our product development side, we have a team that's designed to really think about product development to really be inclusive. So if I take an example from an ability perspective, I think a lot of teams are now thinking about not just able bodies, but then those who have some challenges. And if you're designing, for us, we have CPAP machines, and so we have different accessories that patients actually have to put on a mask. And so do you use clips? What if you can't use that based on your ability? Using magnets then becomes a little bit more accessible to patients. And so just like with that, we have to think about that from a racial and ethnicity perspective. And so really beginning to become comfortable with uncomfortable conversations and being willing to challenge, not for the sake of being challenging, but for designing a better product and making sure all of those patients can benefit. I also think that the more that we empower those who are closest to where the design is happening to bring in perspectives that are diverse, I think the closer we'll get there. Tony, you're right. It won't be tomorrow that all of a sudden our engineering teams will be so diverse. It doesn't happen like that. But the more that we build those bridges with groups like at ResMed, our medical affairs organization, is quite diverse, geographically, racially, gender, etc. And we're bringing those perspectives and starting to light interests in other groups to say, let's think differently, and asking questions and being open to saying, I don't know, but I want to learn more, and being able to engage in that conversation and really equipping people to be able to do that becomes really important.
That's excellent. So it's a journey. It's not a one-time, and it's a continuous conversation. Jamie, anything to add to this?
Yeah, so two things actually. So the one thing that I've learned from some of this dialogue that we've had is I do want to challenge everybody on the call here today who's listening. Go back and figure out how to help your companies help you bring kids to work, because we talk about how do we get children into product development life cycle, into medical careers. You see things when you're a kid, right? And that's when you become so impassioned. And we're all doing activities right now at the college level and reaching out, but go and see if your companies will allow you to bring the kids in sooner, right? When they're in grade school and early on in elementary school and in junior high school. So that's the one thing that I'm sitting here today going, I need to go advocate for that. And let's see if we all can. Second, when I go back, Netta, to some conversations that we had at the last webinar, we were talking about anatomical features and in the product development lifecycle, how the engineering teams generally have been tasked with designing for the anatomical features, in our case, in medical devices. After some of these conversations, again, that we've had, we've gone back and challenged the teams to say, how can you be more inclusive? What additional questions can you pull into the product development lifecycle? How about things such as physical, socioeconomic, cultural? And some things that came out of these unintended questions were actually really good when we start saying, okay, as engineers, instead of just looking at how the device may sit inside the human body, what does scarification mean to different communities, right? We know in Japan, people are very adverse to any scars on the body. What can the engineering team do to be aware of that, raise those questions, and figure out different ways to reduce scarification? What can we learn culturally, whether it's Western medicine, Eastern medicine, Ayurvedic medicine? What are these other medicines that people might take that may interrupt or impact the device itself? And engineers, how can you all be aware of that and raise that as something that needs to be addressed in the product development life cycle? And then we've talked in the past about socioeconomic factors, certainly like diet or access to medications, things like that. So in our case, if a patient has to be put on a lifelong medication after a device is implanted, what might be the socioeconomic barriers that might prevent them, say, from going to a Coumadin clinic every week to get Coumadin checks, or for paying for that medicine lifelong? So we're trying to funnel those questions now back in, even at the engineering team level, just as a result of some of these conversations that we've had. And you're really starting to see the diversity within the team spark, because everyone's got some sort of access or exposure to this, and they're raising really good questions. So I wanted to point that out.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jamie. Leading the effort. And it really does start with, just stopping and asking some of these basic questions. And sometimes you're going to feel uncomfortable, but change won't happen when you're comfortable. So I just want to tell our listeners today, we really do welcome your participation. So if you have questions as our panelists are discussing, please feel free to send them in, and we'll definitely try and address them as we go along. So maybe we can shift to the clinical trial or clinical design space, because I know there was a lot of interest from our previous panel. We've talked about, designing with diversity in mind, challenging our teams to think beyond what an anatomical space. But now, how do we think about, first of all, engaging diverse patients in clinical studies? And maybe just a few nuggets there of some best practices you're employing or things folks listening can think about. And then even at the start of designing a clinical study, what are some of the factors that, now when you put on your clinical study design hat, that you would consider to bring in that diversity inclusion perspective in mind? Who'd like to go first? First one to unmute, I told you.
Go, Kimberly.
I will do that. So this will actually give the rest of the panelists a little bit of time to think about this. I had the pleasure of collaborating on a recent guide that AdvaMed put together that's entitled Approaches to Increasing Diversity in Clinical Research and Addressing Health Inequities. And it talks about some practical ways of thinking about it, including how to have those conversations internally first, because it's going to take time and it's going to take investment. One of the things that one of our groups did when we first had a conversation around the George Floyd murder, so this is back in 2020, and we were talking about diversity and then health inequities, and one of our teams out of Australia went back and took a look at the inclusion of the patients in some of their early studies. And they realized they had been going to the same site because it was easy to recruit patients, and lo and behold, most of them were Caucasian. And even when they looked at Australia versus the US, and they looked at the US data, they were like, oh. So what they did themselves was put in some metrics internally to say, we want to shift this number by X percentage, and we want to be intentional with which patients we actually recruit, so that we're making sure that our devices and accessories are actually used by, you know, diverse patients, but we're also getting that feedback. And so I think it's also challenging ourselves to think beyond our usual sites, because it's easy, quick, cheaper sometimes, and really think about how do we broaden that. And if we don't have good access to diverse investigators, how do you actually take the time to develop those relationships? So that is my offer to the group.
Who wants to jump in? Jamie, you're already unmuted, so you're ahead of the curve. You're like, I'm ready to go. She beat you on this one.
Really made great points. And I would add to that. So FDA just put out a great guidance document for diversity in clinical trials in April of this year. I would say if everyone can start to infuse that into their clinical trial designs, because what it forces the teams to do in a really good way is to sit down and think through their inclusion plan, not just internally at a sponsor company level, but you can actually employ this tool with your hospitals, your research coordinators, your physicians, your nurses. It doesn't take but a really short period of time to read through. It's a short guidance document, maybe 8 to 10 pages. And you work together as a team to figure out, how do you not go to the same sites for speed? How do you, if you are a site, how do you actually recognize your own institutional barriers that may prevent patients from being included? Whether you have to see a certain number of patients within every 10 minutes, and so that restricts maybe who you might offer a clinical trial to. It causes everybody to sit down and actually have to think through this. And once you become aware of some of those biases, you start to maybe change the way at all different levels of the clinical research process that you might be offering or recruiting to a trial. And the second thing that I'll say in addition to the plan is, I had one site give me some really great feedback once recently here, and they said, we look at every patient that comes in as someone who should be in a clinical trial. And that really resonated with me, because if you're looking at that as a synergistic activity, you have to treat the patient anyway. But if there's a trial out there and you're screening them for a trial, you're actually changing access just by that simple step alone, looking at every patient as a possible clinical trial participant. So I'll throw that out for consideration.
I think that last point is really spot on. I mean, great points by Kimberly and Jamie, but you know, we work with centers that have that particular mindset that Jamie just mentioned. Every person that comes in is a potential candidate. So they're not cherry picking, they're not looking at someone based on their background. You're equal in terms of your opportunity to participate. So I was jotting down some notes as I was hearing this. So I think one, what gets measured gets done. So for us, we put into our goals and objectives at the end of the year, in terms of all of our clinical trials across all of the therapeutic areas that I have, I say to the team, I want to see diversity increase in terms of patients as well as in terms of physicians. So we're measuring this and we're going to get it done, and it's actually tied to our year-end review. So we got to hold ourselves accountable in that way. We're also speaking with IDNs, physician networks, patient advocacy groups. And it's not just the who, but the where. So with the diverse physician advisory boards that we have, we spoke with, for example, with an African-American cardiologist, and he said, look, you can talk to me all you want, but I can literally count on one hand the number of Black patients I've treated. So not only do you have to speak with the right physicians, but you got to go to the communities where these underserved patients are. And so really looking at the locations of these centers, and as Jamie said, and as well as Kimberly, not going to the usual suspects, but really reaching out to new centers where those patients reside and partnering with them. And last point is really, how are we engaging these patients? Earlier, I mentioned that we're not speaking to patients directly, but after the informed consent and the patients participate, the cycle tends to end. They think, okay, I participated in a clinical trial, but what's the outcome? If we can do a better job in disseminating in a very simple way what the outcomes of that research were, then the patients start to really understand what they contributed to, and by word of mouth, they can share with others, hey, this is what being in a clinical trial is like. And so I think the dissemination to the participants, very important. We do a great job in disseminating to the physicians who participated, but I don't think we do a good job in disseminating to the patients, and that's an important aspect that I think we can do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Tony. And the other thing that I think about is, right after signing the informed consent, who does the patient see next? They may see the physician that recruited them in, but what's the staff that they're going to have to deal with every day? So the infrastructure behind the clinical trial is also really important, to have diverse voices and diverse viewpoints. So we can't just stop at the front door, so to speak. We got to get in the house, mess it up a little bit, rearrange it, get it where we need to be, and then show people out to the backyard where they're going to have the party, where we get the results, where we see how we impacted. So along that entire journey, we have to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion through all phases. So the support of a clinical trial is almost as important as the funding for a clinical trial. So the infrastructure of how that trial is run, so that if you do have the opportunity to have interim reports, what is that analysis and who's doing the analysis? Who makes decisions about if there is bias? Is this cohort right? Is that cohort right? Are our endpoints actually the endpoints that we need? So throughout the entire development of the clinical trial, the ideation of the clinical trial, number one, are we asking the right questions to reach every population that we're interested in? Are they the right sets of values that we should be looking at? And then that, I think, really importantly, the thing that makes the wheel go round are all the people that support the clinical trial to help get people in, keep them engaged, keep up the data, and then produce the data at the end.
Absolutely. I think, Tony, when you said disseminating the findings or the process back to the patients, we've heard that a lot throughout our subcommittee work. The trust aspect, especially when it comes to clinical research, it's broken. We're trying to build back, but specifically within these certain underrepresented groups. So moving at the speed of trust, showing them that we're not just coming in to take your information and then go develop something that you'll never see the output of that could truly help or benefit. So it's a cycle, isn't it? And feeding it back. I just wanted to read something that Jada Selma put into the chat, and she provided another example of highlighting diverse patient populations through arts. And I think, Kimberly, you spoke a little bit to that, right? And how it can be achieved with working with external organizations. So Medtronic's spine business worked with Marcus John to spotlight his organization that showcases art made by or that contains sclerosis patients. And they also had Marcus come and present to the African Descent Network Employee Resource Group during the Black History Program. And there they highlighted his work along with Black physicians who treat sclerosis. So there's different ways to engage with different participants and also speak in a voice that your end user can relate to, right? It's how you approach that end user. So, and I wanted to tap into another aspect of clinical studies, because it's the patient engaging with them. But then as Sharice, you spoke, throughout that clinical study, who they interface with and what that person may look like. And we speak to the need for diverse physicians. But I know we touched on this last time we spoke, but it's also throughout the clinical continuum or the clinical study what's the word I'm looking for? The clinical study execution, who you engage with and how they engage with patients, how they build that trust. Maybe if Jamie, you could start it off in terms of speaking to some of the approaches that you employ there.
Yeah. So when you go back and you look at that team concept, right, a lot of times we think, oh, we'll just explain the study to like a Dr. Sparks, like to the physician. But when we start the trials, or as we're doing the lead up to starting a site, we try to bring the entire hospital research team together that may have those touch points with the patient, and we explain the program to them. Part of what I think needs to continue to be infused into this is not only raising sort of the bias and how do we interrupt the cascade of bias when we're educating them on the research program, but as we carry the research forward, we need to keep bringing that same group of people back together, not just the physician and giving that person the update or having them update us, bringing that entire research team back together and sharing examples of biases that have impacted or that are impacting sites, what people are doing that are changing the dynamics of the program and being more inclusive. Status updates where, to Tony's point or to Dr. Sparks's point, where we may see something that's impacting a certain arm of the trial, raising that to the entire team. So if there's a change that can be made at the hospital research team level, you can actually course correct. You're not unblinding trials. You're not looking at something too prematurely, but you're bringing everybody along the journey, because we tend to start the trials with everybody, and then it goes into this sort of bake process where nobody looks at the trials, and then it pops out on the backside with a product approval, but we're not bringing people along the journey and talking about diversity and inclusion along the way. So that would be a change that we're trying to do.
Excellent. Does anyone else have any input there? Kimberly?
The only thing I would just add is great point about that research infrastructure. The physician is really one important cog in that wheel, but there's a whole support staff that is working with that physician through that research continuum. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier about recruiting people into the health sciences field and in areas where they can be impactful with diverse patient populations. So we're also looking at research centers that not only have diverse physicians, but also diverse research support staff, whether it be coordinators, nursing staff, et cetera, and how do we better partner with them? Because that's one way in which we can continue to allow the sites to build trust as they disseminate evidence to the patients downstream.
Kimberly, I saw you had unmuted. Were you going to add some?
No, I was going to commend Jamie's group for doing that. I mean, I think it's also this thought process of how do we walk alongside organizations who want to evolve. We can put in really high standards and realize no one will meet those. But what are those incremental steps that we can make so that we can keep things going forward? I think, are there ways for us to partner different institutions, especially if a group isn't as well versed in how do you identify diverse patients? Or is there a group that does it really well and almost becomes kind of this shared best practices network that could be evolved? And so I think it's thinking outside the box, having conversations like this that spark ideas and continuing that. It's just something else, but nothing beyond specific examples. I thought Jamie's was really great.
Yeah, I had one more.
Oh yeah, please go ahead, Jamie.
One more. I just realized we started something last year as a pilot that we're carrying into this year, which is way upstream. So doing some screening, some health screening fair type studies. They're not really a study, but it's an educational process where we're seeing patients really early on before they ever even need the medical product that we manufacture. And it's educating them on what they can do in terms of dietary changes, what questions they can ask their physician to get better care now. So hopefully 15, 20, 30 years from now, they actually don't need our medical device, but should they, they've come along the journey and they're learning how to self-advocate and they're learning ways that they can take care of themselves, and it's not a surprise later. So that was something else that I wanted to raise in terms of these health screening fairs that we've started putting on, and they've been tremendously eye-opening, and I've learned a ton from them this past year.
I think that's a interesting way of building trust with the industry, right? It's not just we want to sell you something or we want you to be in our clinical trial because we need the data in order to make money, but it's we want to invest in your well-being and see us as a partner, a trusted partner. So thanks for sharing that.
It speaks to the social determinants of health are a big driver of health inequities, right? There's the political determinants of health also, and the intersectionality of that, and how you're seeing the poor outcomes in these marginalized groups. So collecting some of those social determinants of health, understanding them, and feeding that in downstream to when you're actually developing a product is invaluable. So again, kudos to you, Jamie and team. Dr. Sparks, you've been quiet. I know you have a lot going on in the back of your mind, so please chime in.
No, I really am with Kimberly. I really applaud Jamie and what they're doing. You know, the one thing that I just would ask everybody else to think about too, and challenge even the, you know, the members of this panel, is we have to take a look at ourselves too, because we have to acknowledge our biases before we can ever begin to change anything around us. And so as the leaders of these initiatives, we have to understand where we are and how we can help others define where they are. So we get the right outcome, because if we go into it with sort of a crooked vision, it might come out a little crooked. So I would just encourage that we also take that inward look. But all these other, you know, the other part that's really exciting about hearing all the work that's happening on this panel is just the simple education, letting people know, calling this out as an issue, making it an issue that needs a solution, and then encouraging innovative solutions to help answer the call. So I really, really appreciate this time and the call that we're making to others through this discussion.
Thank you, because that'll lead me to another quick question before we start to wrap up. Is you said, you know, understanding or recognizing our unconscious bias as an individual and how that may impact either product development or running of clinical study. I think one of our previous panels had said your first interaction with a physician will determine the trajectory of what healthcare you get exposed to. And at the end of it, we're all driving at developing innovative products. But if they can't get to that end user and meet that end user's needs, we failed, right? So maybe here is, can you speak to one thing we could do to recognize our own unconscious bias and how that might come to surface and impact whichever space we're in, be it the product development or the clinical trial design, execution, and so forth?
I think you have to be open, because it's not going to happen you talking to yourself. It's going to happen you talking to others. So like Tony was saying, being engaged in those uncomfortable conversations, actually wanting to engage, putting yourself in the position to hear what others may perceive about you, because you may not have the insight to be able to perceive it about yourself. So I think putting yourself in the position to hear where you are is really important. So being committed to be courageous, being committed to be uncomfortable, and being committed to change if you need to.
Love it. Tony, you're unmuted.
So going back to the uncomfortable conversation, you know, we often talk about education and awareness of the patients who are underserved, but I think there's education and awareness of ourselves. It's exactly what Charisse just said. I also often tell my kids, you know, the reason why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth is because we should listen twice as much as we speak. And so being open to hearing the feedback from others in uncomfortable dialogues as we question ourselves, question our process, ultimately looking at the goals that we want to achieve. I think those conversations are very, very important if we're going to make change. Because, you know, the other thing I say to my kids is change starts with me, right? You can't look at other people and say you need to first change. You know, ripples start at the center. So we got to be the catalyst of change, and we've got to ask ourselves, are we holding ourselves accountable for doing the right things? And if not, I need to be open to hearing that from other people. getting that feedback.
Just one more thing to add is our medical affairs group, we almost now annually are doing unconscious bias training. I think we should always be willing to learn more, even if we think that we have it. We probably don't. And so through those types of educational opportunities, but then also the dialogue afterward of what did I hear, what did I learn, and if you have a safe space of other colleagues of let me know if I'm demonstrating that I have some unconscious bias so that I can quickly course correct so that we're doing what's right for the patient and for the company itself. And so that's something else. And we also have a small grassroots group within ResMed that is looking at health disparities and getting education out to spark conversations throughout the company. And it wasn't anything that was necessarily sanctioned, but it's actually being really run by some of our younger members, which that just brings me a lot of joy, knowing that we are entrusting this great work to others so it doesn't just lay or reside with the leadership.
Jamie, please.
Sure. And I would just add, for anybody out there, again, watching this, get uncomfortable, right? We tend to gravitate towards being comfortable, and we all understand that. But these types of initiatives, and to really truly be inclusive, you have to be uncomfortable often, and don't be fearful of it. There are so many wonderful people in this space that if you don't know the answer to something, reach out, ask the question, right? I've met Dr. Sparks, I've met Kimberly, I've met Tony, I've met so many wonderful people just even through this endeavor alone. And by sitting in the room, and I don't have the answers, and sometimes I'm very uncomfortable, but you sit there and you learn and you just keep asking. And if we all keep doing this, eventually we break down all of these barriers and we create true inclusion, certainly in the medical device space, but in the global space. And that's really what this is about, is being uncomfortable to make inclusivity a reality for everybody. Just don't be afraid.
Thank you. Don't be afraid. Go ahead.
I was going to say, on top of that, don't be afraid to call out bad behavior, because that's where the change is going to come. So if you see something, you hear it and it's wrong, let's correct it. We don't have to be vengeful. We don't have to be evil. We can be kind. We can be empathetic in that response, but bad behavior, we have to call it out. So that's where your courage will also sustain you.
Gentle on the person, hard on the process as well. How can we continuously be improving? I know, Kimberly, you have a whole health economics and outcomes research perspective, and you spoke to it early on about, what kind of outcomes could we look at? Patient-reported outcomes, patient preferences. And that's a whole nother topic. So I'm going to put it out there. We'd love to have you come back and have that discussion, because it directly leads into how to design with diversity and inclusion in mind. I really can't thank you all enough. Really appreciate your perspective, your authentic self. You bring your real self to the conversation. You bring your immense experiences, and you challenge us all. So thank you. And I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, as always. So I could just keep speaking to you. I wish this was my day job. But thank you again. Thank you to all the participants. If you had questions even after this, feel free to email them into us. The webinar will be posted on our MedTech Color YouTube channel as well, if you want to go back in and look at some of the nuggets that were shared. We look forward to continuing the discussion, and thank you again. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Netta.
Take
Great
care.
talking.
Bye. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Netta.
Great.
Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Bye-bye.